each other. I may just finish by saying, as a girl, I had a Latin exercise book. I wonder how many of you may have had a similar thing, and it was just fascinating to me. This was a sort of an exercise about ancient sites, Pompeii, this kind of thing. And it was created with layers of acetate. So right, the bottom image was the image of the site as it exists today. And as you laid the acetate pages over this original picture, you built up. Do you know? It's familiar. And there was something so fascinating about that to me. And like Amit, I share this idea of a kind of unhoming, or a sense of being in perpetual exile or a state of traveling to be a rich and creative place, artistically.
Okay, thank you. Now, we would for a moment leave New Zealand and come to Scotland. And I would request you to read out a patch from it if you would like. And this is one book that actually brings two of you very close, because I'm told this is structured on music, on bagpipe music. And here we have, a proven musician.
I know.
And, and music comes back in his writing as a theme. But I think it does more than that. It structures what you write internally, So maybe Amit would like to talk something about that. But please first read out something.
Well, I thought, since we were talking about this idea of the home, or the idea of home being a place that one returns to only periodically, I'll take a section from the book whereby the book is about an old man coming to the end of his life, and he's a piper and a composer, and he is dying. And because of that, his son has been alerted, who he never sees, they're estranged, his name's Callum, to come home and probably say goodbye. And Callum has had summer holidays up at this house since he was a boy, a bit like Amit's boy in the streets of Calcutta, and it's been a place that he associates with a kind of dreamy, this idea of the other kind of time that can inhabit it. But as I say, it's been a long time since he's gone back. For here he is approaching the summit. This is him driving now north. For here he is approaching the summit. And just because the roads may be better than before when he was a boy, and faster with the new bridges, and the curves around the bends straightened, still the view in the windscreen's the same, and out to the sides, it's all familiar. It could as well be that nothing's changed, and he's the same scrawny, scaredy kid coming up through Inverness and Ross, all the way up into the hills you had to go to then, to the bridge and over, before you could come back down wide again and onto the coast. The whole journey right back with him and travelling with him now. And how he used to get sick on it always. Remember that bit of the road there? And on the long, rounding part of the ascent that's behind him now? He still has the memory of the churning in his stomach, all the way from here to where they turned inland at Golspie. The sick taste in the mouth, but at least you were nearly there. His father stopping for a whiskey there, the hotel bar at the Royal, and not much more in it now, is what his father would always say. And you'd go inside then to the bar, and Callum used to sit out on the grass with a bottle of lemonade, maybe something to take up the time, otherwise just sitting through the long summer's afternoon into evening. And his father happier, Callum could hear it through the open window of the bar in his voice. He'd be talking by then not about money or business or what you read in the papers, but in his real voice. There were snatches of it earlier in the car. Aye instead of yes, little pieces of Gaelic maybe, but it was only when he got up here with people that he knew in the Royal, back in the part of the country where he'd been born, like an animal off the cold hills back where he belonged, that you could hear the difference. Callum could, in his voice, the sound of him, in his eye. No wonder his father had returned here at the end.
Thank you. Thank you. Amit, would you like to sort of reflect something about the way music sort of structures your thought and language? it comes back thematically and in a major way in your last book, in Nautilus. But more than that, if you like to say it.
Well, I am trying to think, because this is not very, it's not a question I'm that great at answering. But I'll try to answer it.
Sure.
By saying that no, I'm not consciously aware of using musical structures when I write. You know, I mean, this is my conscious self speaking and saying that when I'm a writer, actually when I'm writing, I'm not aware of being a musician. And only very rarely when I'm a musician am I aware that I'm also a writer. So I enter into these personalities completely and seem to forget the other one during the duration of inhabiting a particular personality. And I work across various genres. So I write, I make music. Even in music, I do this kind of experimental music which I call not fusion, and I do Hindustani classical music. And as a writer, I again lead a split life, a life where one part doesn't seem to, or didn't always seem to know what the other was doing. So I'm a fiction writer, but I'm also a critic and an essayist, and also a non-fiction writer. When I was writing my first book, A Strange and Sublime Address, noticing all the minutiae that I did, and cherishing the here and now, and writing about the real world, I was also writing my critical dissertation in Oxford, borrowing from, while resisting at the same time, Derrida, who questioned the reality of the real world, at least in his vulgarized form. When people found out that the two Amit Chaudhuris were at work, one sort of reading Derrida and the other writing about the everyday, they couldn't reconcile the two. And this kind of problem has persisted throughout my creative life, of some parts of me always being ungoverned by others. There is no overseer or overlord controlling all the different facets. The analogy I always make is to multilingualism, bilingualism, and being creative in 2 or 3 languages. At least being creative in 2 languages, which is very rare and very difficult and very rarely done successfully. But I think of the Indian poet Arun Polatkar, who wrote both in English and in Marathi. In English, he was a writer of the mundane, a poet of the mundane. And in Marathi, he was a kind of dystopian science fiction poet about cosmic worlds, the mythic. He jotted down aphorisms. He anyway was very, very reluctant about publishing any of his work. But among his many unpublished kind of pieces of writing were aphorisms he wrote about being a bilingual poet. And among his aphorisms was one which said, "I keep a pencil sharpened at both ends," which basically means that it's a question of opportunity for the multilingual or the multidisciplinary person. You will find certain things opening up as you inhabit one personality, and you kill the other one when you inhabit that one. And when you move back to another one, you find other possibilities opening up and others closing down. But I don't think, and I don't say this with any self-satisfied kind of sophistry, but I don't think there's any one that is necessarily more true creatively than the other.
Yeah, I think that's really exciting. Can I just come in here? I think this idea of putting yourself willfully, knowingly, in a state of great vulnerability, if you like, because obviously I can't claim to these wonderful bilingual, I wish I could write a bit of science fiction to make some money, but that idea of willfully setting a project that's going to be difficult, that is going to be terrifying, going to take you somewhere you know not where, that makes it a fully engaging creative and intellectual project in a way that those who find their territory and keep mining it must surely not experience.
Yes. Yes. And when Amit says that he doesn't use it, consciously, the musical part phrase. And when it's said about your new novel that it is structured around music, backed by music, would you agree to that? And if it is structured around, there must have been some conscious planning to it. If you could say a bit about that.
Well, I think, again, Amit and I feel like we have much in common, but like the Immortals, there's this theme running throughout the big music, that the music stands for something other. It's the practice of art, but it's the idea of something that sits beyond the quotidian, the everyday, and has value, a kind of, beautiful, abstract, unworldly value. And I think that, certainly for me, I've been talking again about this with the students, that the books begin with this sense of place that we talk about, but I also knew that this was to be the Highland novel, and I also knew that I wanted to use that pibroch structure as part of it. My father's a piper, so the intervals of the music are very familiar to me, the tunes are very familiar, and I knew that the sound reflected perfectly the kind of landscape I wanted to explore, and the kind of lives that were being lived in that landscape, with the notes sitting far apart from each other and having rare moments of coming together, and a kind of plangent dissonance in parts. I knew that music perfectly represented the kind of story I thought that was there to tell.
Sure. Amit, now getting back to you again, the way, it could be my own reading, but the way I read your novels, it's like I see it as a kind of anthropology, to use a wrong word perhaps, of Bengali domesticity and Bengali belief, but an anthropology done with a very acute eye and in a language that cannot be bettered. And here comes your musical training perhaps in a way. But the interesting thing that happens in that is in that kind of transference between literature and anthropology is that, the personalness of what we know as public comes out very clearly. Ordinary people going about their ordinary ways, mostly funny, at times sad. But in this whole transaction, what is known as public gets constructed. And even if a valorized big public event comes in a way, you seem to capture it, perhaps, and I'm just thinking, perhaps through, let's say, talking about earlier days, the transistor set, which works, but also doesn't exactly work. And in between these two, working and not working, in that funny space, you seem to implicate that big public event to the point where the public event becomes funny itself. Would you agree to something like that?
The transistor set or the radio not working, I can understand. I mean, because I'm interested in botched
Yes.
projects and things that don't work.
Absolutely.
Well, I mean, I'm interested in the ordinary, and I'm interested in the city. I'm interested in a certain notion of the city, and I'm interested in modernity. So I think I first encountered, as I say in my book Calcutta, I think I first encountered modernity in Calcutta. And by modernity, I've floundered about this word and tried to explain what I might possibly mean by it. I said there quite right away that I didn't mean a sense of progress, I didn't mean electricity, electric lights, I didn't mean the recent as being modern. What I meant was often cities that look old and derelict but are new. And I speculated on whether the modern, the truly modern, had been born old, had been born decayed. And I thought about cities and neighborhoods I'd encountered in New York and in Berlin that possessed this modernity but also seemed implausibly old. I was interested in this feature of modernity because I grew addicted to it. I mean, it's as simple as that. But I was drawn to it. And the addiction first happened in Calcutta. So it's in Calcutta that I grew sort of drawn to and then addicted to something that was at once decrepit, smelly, to come back to the radio or transistor, slightly non-functional, but at the same time something that drew you in and in a way that the finished and the polished and the perfect didn't. So it was a particular kind of addiction. Having been schooled by Calcutta in what my addiction was, I would then go sniffing it out, the source of what would satisfy the addiction in various cities of the world. And when I didn't find what satisfied it, I would be deeply and ontologically unhappy. So when I went to San Diego, for instance, I was for the first time puzzled by the prettiness and cheerfulness that surrounded me and made me unhappy. I was puzzled by why this was the case. And then I went to New York in 1979 this was. So New York was not in boom, it hadn't packaged itself. And it was still known to be a dangerous city. It was like disreputable, you were warned, don't go into the subway, you might get killed. And there was the smell of urine clinging to the walls. And I felt life was coming back to me. So I could only explain it as a kind of perverse addiction to something that isn't very good for you. So I have no moral justification or defense for my love of modernity. I have no defense for that. I would say therefore that my home is not so much Calcutta as it is the modern, in my understanding of it. It is the modern that I seek and search for. And it comes to me from various sources. It has come to me from New Zealand as well. You know, somebody, Dipesh Chakraborty, a well-known historian, said to me, Amit, how do you work with material you're so close to? So he was talking about Bengali culture. He said, you're so close to it. I find that I spend hours researching something in the archive, say Bengali culture, and then I feel stifled, I can't work on it anymore. And I said, well, it always came to me by a translation. I discovered Calcutta in the stories of Catherine Mansfield, in some of the stories of Joyce, and in the works of D.H. Lawrence. All of that was marked by a certain kind of modernity. And that's what I found echoed. That's what I found was echoing my experience of Calcutta. So there's this strange mixture of recognition and distance in the way we go about discovering our terrain as writers.
I think your thoughts about the modern are absolutely riveting and provide a perfect kind of metaphor for the modernist project. That idea of acknowledging what has gone on before, as you say, a kind of ancient, stinking oldness, reminds us of the job we have to, the quoting Pound, make it new. This, returning to my old Latin exercise book again, this idea of we've got the picture underneath, we lay the acetate mindfully over the top to create the next thing. This idea of it being something made, something worked at, something that one deliberately sets oneself to, whether that's loosening oneself into other genre or taking oneself into another language. These are all absolutely key to the job of being modern. I think you outlined it in the book so beautifully.
Or even discovering your terrain, first of all, elsewhere. So you read Dublin, you read about Dublin, you read Joyce, and then you come back to Calcutta. Conversely, you go to Dublin, you think, this is not a city I know at all. It's never been described. What is the Dublin that was being talked about by Joyce? You go to that city and you think, what is this place?
Yeah. What I love and find so fascinating about this book, about many things, is the way you make the city itself, the reality of the city, a kind of fictional project. By writing about it in the way you do, you make it an imagined or could be imagined place. You start to think about the dream Calcutta, the remembered Calcutta, the possible Calcutta, as well as the real that you detail with such, detail, as you said, that minute attention.
Well, Amit, would you like to read out some?
That's true. Maybe she was very small and short. Keep talking.
Yes, I was laughing when you gave us the subtitles of the Common Cause. Post-colonial ethics and the practice of democracy. What a title! We poor fiction writers don't come close.
Perfectly out of place here.
Yeah.
I'm just going to read out something at random. I'm going to read out an essay from a new collection of essays, and something entirely at random.
Should I open the page?
Just open it up. Right? Okay. This isn't too long. This is called Close-Ups in Hindi Films. By close-ups in Hindi cinema, I don't mean movies today, though these aren't necessarily excluded, but primarily those of the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. In other words, films made in the midst of, marked by, and contributed to the music renaissance, the golden age of film songs. So this is Hindi film songs. Many of us know that the close-up is not one of filmmaking's respectable undertakings, and is looked on with almost as much disdain by trained filmmakers as the zoom shot is. Yet why did it possess such transcendental beauty in Hindi movies? Part of it has to do with the untranslatable quality of the Indian face, particularly the Indian head, and its range of expressions and gestures, both fleeting and recurrent. I use the catch-all term Indian because Hindi cinema, located as it is in Bombay, occupies the borderline of north and south, of Karnataka and the land further below, but also of Gujarat in the west and then further north into Punjab. Not to speak of the impact of migrant Bengalis. And so one notices a gamut of cranial movements in Hindi films. Not pan-Indian movements, but a collage of shakes and nods from different parts of the country. That may be richer than its counterpart in other parts of India, however compelling popular cinema and its faces in, say, 1950s Bengal might have been. There's no denying the complexity of the codes that inform moving the head from side to side in this country. The arc or swivel from left to right, or right to left, or left to right to left to right, have all sorts of registers here, and only one of them means no. I recall standing early one morning in Gloucester Green, the central bus station in Oxford, waiting with my wife and mother for the bus to Heathrow. As usual, my mother found herself in the middle of a conversation with a young woman, a Japanese student, who, like her, was also going to India, although she'd be visiting it for the first time. She was very soft-spoken, but at one point, amused by some thought, she started laughing and leaned forward at the same time to explain to my mother, who began to smile too. When I asked my mother later about what had caused laughter, she said she's a bit nervous about going to India because she isn't sure she'll understand what people are saying. She has heard that Indians say yes by shaking their head from side to side. It's undeniable that a straightforward nod exists in India, an urgent, vigorous indicator of agreement. Urgent, vigorous, but frugally used. Because other head movements are employed more commonly to signal agreement, but in a more emollient, tender manner. There is the sideways shake of the head, which in other countries means no. Confusingly, in India it means no too, but one can also, in the right context, infer absolute unqualified agreement from it. Then there is, often seen in Bengal but perhaps not exclusive to it, and especially used by Bengali girls, the tilting of the head to one side. This gesture in England would be accompanied by the eyes following the same direction the head is tilted towards to suggest, look at that. In Bengal, the head is tilted gently, but the eye contact with the interlocutor is immovable. The tilt is the most ingenuous gesture available to imply agreement, assent, even complicity. All right, theek ache, or yes, I'll do it, and korbo. Further south, people are apt to make doll-like movements with their head. Not a shake of the head, but quick tilts on either side. Almost, but not quite, a cranial rotation. Again, this, notwithstanding its wobbliness, is essentially a genteel, unintrusive gesture meant to convey agreement and camaraderie without starkly emphasizing and reducing these to a single unambiguous movement as a simple nod does. That the nod and the shake of the head with their conventional global significances of agreement and disagreement respectively are also part of this vocabulary of gestures brings home to us the sweet contradictoriness of Indian emotive life. This emotive life and its gradations and paradoxes are nowhere as clearly on display as in the life of the face and the head of both the listener and the artist during a North Indian classical music performance. The most reliable integer of a listener being touched or moved by a phrase that the singer has just rendered is the movement of the head from side to side, what in most contexts means denial or disagreement. Here it means astonishment, delight, and also incongruously stoic resignation. All three, astonishment, delight, and resignation, are components of wonder, the wonder that accompanies revelation. But why resignation, denoted so fully to the brim by that shake of the head? Is it at the fact that what might have seemed implausibly beautiful has somehow been made possible without us